Hello there, and welcome back to another adventure. Sometimes it could be an adventure, especially if you were there, of Cafe Biblos, and we're talking about, we're still in the first chapter of Mark, but things are starting to heat up a little bit with Jesus in Capernaum. And we're going to look at some things and explore some things. We're actually going to do an introduction because in the last half of the first chapter, Jesus is starting to perform his miracles and his teaching. But there's some important history that you need to be aware of as we explore this. So, a lot of the comments that you're going to hear from both Eric and myself are taken from a commentary on the Gospel of Mark from David Stewart, which he published in 2016. So we want to thank David for that. But Capernaum, you hear a lot about Capernaum. It's in Galilee. It's in the northwest section of the Sea of Galilee. And just as a reminder, Jewish settlements were pretty popular along the western edge of the Sea of Galilee. The eastern shores were not very populated, and where they were populated, it was with Gentiles. So Jesus' preaching and teaching were to Israel. The city is about 2.5 miles west of the Jordan River, and it's located on important trade routes. So you had a lot of caravans and things going through there. The city was large enough that there was a contingent of Roman garrison with a centurion there. Being on a trade route, there was a customs booth, which means taxes. And eventually, Jesus is going to find Levi, or Matthew, who became one of his apostles, working there. Jesus' entrance into Capernaum marks a new chapter in his life. And we're going to look at some things because, wait a minute, Jesus was born where? Where was he born? No, he wasn't born in Nazareth. He was raised in Nazareth.
I'm sorry, Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, that's what they call him.
It's Bethlehem.
It's Bethlehem. Yeah,
Bethlehem.
He was born in Bethlehem to fulfill.
Brain fart.
That's to fulfill an Old Testament prophecy that we can read about in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. And I'm going to have Eric read that.
FYI, brain's not working too well. I recently started working out again, and the effects of running have fried my brain a little bit.
He's becoming hypoxic.
Yeah.
You wearing a mask when you run?
No. That'd be like wearing a mask in a car, which is not offensive or wrong if that's what you want to do, but that's not something I'm going to do. All right, Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judea, are by no means least among the leaders of Judea, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel."
Okay, so he was born in Bethlehem. He grew up in Nazareth. We know the story. Herod tried to kill him. Joseph was warned by an angel. They fled to Egypt. They stayed in Egypt for a time period until Herod died. And then they came back and decided to settle in Nazareth because of who was on the throne at that time. So, they went to Nazareth. Jesus was known as Jesus the Nazarene. And a lot of people would be given that name where they came from. Matthew's gospel states that Jesus settled in Capernaum and made this kind of his base of operations, and that's in Matthew chapter 4, verse 13.
He came and settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali.
That's close. Naphtali. Those are one of the two of the tribes of Israel. Capernaum is also referred to as his own city in Matthew chapter 9, verse 1. So, Jesus is in Galilee. We look at where we're at now in Mark is Mark 1, 21 through 45 is the whole back half of the story. So, Eric, I'm going to let you kind of pick up and give a summary about what's going to happen.
All right, well, in Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 45, there are several stories linked together because of where they took place. The events are tied together by chronological markers in a span of a day or two. On the Sabbath, which we see in Mark chapter 1, verse 21, after coming out of the synagogue, which is Mark chapter 1, verse 29, after sunset in the evening, Mark chapter 1, verses 32, and in the early morning before sunrise, as we see in Mark chapter 1, verses 35. These events illustrate four facets of Jesus' ministry. One of them is teaching, and we see the teaching in Mark chapter 21, 22, and 27.
Those are verses. 120.
Yeah, 121, 22,
Yeah.
27.
You said Mark chapter 22.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Like I said, it's a real condition called running brain, and it's running to the ground.
It gets better as you get used to it.
Casting out demons, which we see in Mark chapter 1, verses 23 through 26, 32 through 34, and verse 39.
You got it. Yeah.
Healing the sickness and disease, which we also see in Mark chapter 1, verses 29 through 34, and also in verses 40 and through 45. And his preaching, which is in Mark chapter 1, verses 38 and 39. Jesus later condemns the city due to a poor response to his miracles and teaching. And we find these events in Matthew chapter 11, verses 23 and 24, and Luke chapter 10, verse 15.
So let's take a look at the events in Capernaum. Where is the very first place that we find Jesus and his followers when he arrives in the city?
Don't ask me. I can't trust myself today.
You weren't there. All right.
I can't trust myself today.
He goes to the synagogue. And besides worshiping, why else would he go there? Let's answer that question in a little bit. So, we know that Jesus taught regularly in the synagogues. We read about that in Luke chapter 4, 31 through 37. Can you think of someone else in their travels and in their teaching and spreading the gospel who first went to the synagogue to teach? I'm going to ask you again.
Paul?
Yeah, you're close. Yeah, that's it.
Paul.
Wherever Paul went on his missionary journeys, that's where he would go. Even though he was preaching to the Gentiles, he would first present to the Jews, and then he would go to the Gentiles. So that's the synagogue was a meeting place. So then, this brings up another question. What happened to temple worship? We know that the tabernacle was converted to the temple, Solomon's temple, and then Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Nehemiah and the Jews, when they came back from the Babylonian captivity, tried to they build it back up again. Herod the Great comes along and restores the temple in a 40-year time period. But how come they're not worshiping in the temple? We have to understand geographically. The temple was located in Jerusalem. We're in Galilee. So when did synagogue worship begin? And did God sanction worshiping in the synagogue? I would say yes, because that's where we find Jesus. And this is what I was able to come up with. With the Babylonian captivity, the Jews were exiled due to their sin in 586 BC. Jerusalem and Solomon's temple were destroyed. Since the temple was destroyed and all the instruments of worship taken, what would they do? I would imagine the ark was probably taken as well, the Ark of the Covenant. So they got together and started having regular meetings, and these meetings were for prayer and study of the Hebrew Scriptures. As they eventually scattered all over the Mediterranean basin, they took this custom with them. They took this practice. By the 1st century, synagogue meetings had been established for well over 500 years. A typical synagogue service. One, you have a synagogue ruler who was in charge of the service. You had an attendant who would bring out the scriptures from the ark, or the Torah, which was the place where the scriptures were kept in Luke chapter 4:20. And then he would bring it to the reader. The law and the prophets were read, and then a visiting rabbi or rabbis were given the opportunity to teach. And this is what Jesus was doing. Note, synagogues were often multifaceted buildings, also used as schools, banquets, inns, and courts in Mark 13 and 9. And they all faced south. Since we're in Galilee, they would be facing south. So the question I asked you earlier, why else would Jesus go there besides worshiping? It kind of makes good sense, because there was an audience there that was ready to listen to God's word. So they were already conditioned. So Jesus grew up attending synagogues services on the Sabbath in Luke 4:16. It was his custom to teach in the synagogues throughout Galilee. Archaeologically, there have been ruins of 50 synagogues in Galilee alone. And since the synagogues faced Jerusalem when Jesus taught, he was facing the city that one day he would die in. So that's where we're at. A little bit of history for Jesus in Capernaum. Next, we're going to look at, let's see what we were going to look at. Oh, Jesus in a synagogue. And so please stay tuned and come back and listen again. God bless you.
God bless.